1912. We will hear from one of the most remarkable and hardworking women of the Episcopal Church in North Carolina, founder of the Women's Auxiliary in our diocese, which at that time, the time of her early ministry, included the whole state. Mrs. Wilkes, please.
It has been a long life, and I pray that God's mercy will prove infinite in allowing my humble service to be considered favorably in the kingdom. My good Swedish father, having traveled from his native Sweden to the West Indies and then to England, eventually settled in New York City in the year of war, 1812. I was born and reared in that great city until my marriage to a man of worth and good deeds, Captain John Wilkes, who brought me to Charlotte in the year of our marriage, 1850. From that day on, though I had been raised a Presbyterian, I devoted myself to the mission of the Episcopal Church and to the people of North Carolina. My husband served St. Peter's Church as senior warden for more than 50 years. I devoted myself to the North Carolina Women's Auxiliary for so many years that I cannot consider my life apart from my work with the women of the diocese. One of the best inspirations of my life was to ask Bishop Theodore Wyman in 1881 to approve the founding of a woman's auxiliary branch in North Carolina. With his blessing and support, we organized in the following year. The bishop appointed me executive secretary, and my husband said, "This is what happens to those who have bright ideas." I served in that capacity until 1895. In 1906, I was elected once again and have served under the title of permanent president until this year of our Lord, 1912. The second most important desire of my heart was fulfilled with the founding of 2 hospitals in Charlotte. Let me explain. God gave us 9 children, but only 4 of them remain alive to this day, and I pray that they will outlive me. The sadness of illness and early death is not unknown to me, a woman of privilege and some standing in our community. But oh, the suffering of those who don't have the means to live in a lovely home, to be safe, adequately fed, and clean. Soon after our arrival in Charlotte, the Civil War started, and soon I was caring for the sick and wounded in the terrible conditions of the Charlotte Military Institute. My dream from that awful time on had been to collect money for the building of the first hospital in Charlotte. We started with 2 rooms in the first month of 1876. Now, with the help of the Ladies' Aid Society at St. Peter's Church, we have St. Peter's Hospital, a modern general hospital with 75 beds. 10 years later, I had collected enough funds to open the Good Shepherd Hospital for our colored citizens who had no one else to care for them. What is a life worth? I have been given much. From me, much has been required. Year after year, as Executive Secretary of the Women's Auxiliary, my plan has been to encourage women all around the diocese to give of their treasure, however minute, for even a penny counts in the eyes of the Lord, as Jesus taught us in the parable of the lost coin. I encourage them to contribute for 3 causes: 1 diocesan, 1 domestic, meaning the rest of the country, and 1 foreign. All I can pray for is that with my visits to the parishes of the diocese and my persistent letter writing, I have at least made them aware of the needs of others. And now the time for my departure is drawing near. Like St. Paul, I too pray that I have fought the good fight.
Lives of the church, dating back to the late 19th and early 20th centuries, reveal how much effort parishes in North Carolina spent in raising money and supporting missionaries, most especially missionaries in China. The fundraising efforts to assist missionaries were mostly the responsibility of the Women's Auxiliary, and many of the courageous missionaries were women. We know a great deal about one such missionary, Miss Laura Clark of Scotland Neck, a graduate of St. Mary's College in Raleigh. Laura Clark served in Washington during World War I, and later in 1934 was sent as a missionary to China, where she worked for the Diocese of Anqing. Most of us have learned from books and movies of the suffering of the Chinese people during those terrible World War years. Laura Clark experienced the difficulties firsthand. She wrote detailed and at times funny letters to her family, who were gracious in sharing them with the diocese through the diocesan paper called at that time North Carolina Churchman. Let's hear directly from Laura Clark.
It is July 1938. Once again, because of upheavals, we have to move. Thursday, the day we were leaving for Cooling, was a day of almost torrential downpour. There was a large crowd trying to leave on the small boat, and the only accommodation we could get was second-class Chinese, which meant 3 or 4 of us packed in one small cabin. Mary and I were not together, and we found that each had 3 men for cabin mates. We decided to sit up all night somewhere, but the captain came to our rescue and gave us a cabin reserved for a man who didn't show up. There were 16 in our party, all from the diocese. When we reached Kuakang, we had to get across the plain and were told we could hire a car if the car would run. After a long wait, we realized evidently the car would not run. So we tried to get the bus and finally succeeded in chartering the whole bus and also in filling it. We hadn't had time to pack food, so from 6 Thursday afternoon until 4 the next afternoon, I had 2 small sandwiches and 4 prunes. All my baggage got up safely, including the file cabinet, which I feel is now a part of me. Packing was a hullabaloo, pouring rain and much haste and stir and confusion, and one crate something was oozing out. We found a bottle of salad oil had broken and spilled all over everything, including our salt and sugar, and our flour bag burst. Unpacking was a constant surprise, since I had simply put things in as I passed by. In one box, partly packed by the office coolie, I found office records, 2 dresses, and 2 bottles of salad oil, which fortunately had not broken. In my trunk tray, my shoes were packed in my table napkins, and when I got to the office, there were boxes of vanilla and vinegar snugly packed with my office stationery. In spite of all the current surging underneath, we had some good laughs over the whole trip.
In January 1941, the North Carolina Churchman publishes another letter by Laura Clark, one that gives us a flavor of her affection for the Chinese branch of the church. When she writes our diocese, she means the Diocese of Anqing. She also praises the Women's Auxiliary in North Carolina.
When Bishop Scott sent the short telegram to his predecessor, Bishop Norris, stating 3 consecrate 2, he told a good bit of church history. When the Reverend Robin T.S. Chan, D.D., was consecrated assistant bishop of our diocese, it was the first time that a Chinese bishop had been consecrated bishop of the American Church Mission. There are other Chinese bishops serving out here, but heretofore none of the American Church Mission. When the Reverend Lord T. Craighill was consecrated diocesan at the same service with Dr. Chen, it was the first time in the history of the church that 2 bishops have been consecrated at the same service. And I wonder if it's not the first time in the church history that the diocesan and assistant bishops have been consecrated at the same service. Another thing that made me particularly happy at this time was a very generous gift of the Women's Auxiliary of the Diocese of North Carolina of $1,000 toward the endowment fund of our Chinese bishop. Without this endowment fund, we would not have elected a Chinese bishop, and this wonderful gift from North Carolina made it possible to go through with our plans. Bishop Chan is a man that the whole church can be proud of. He is fitted in every way to be a bishop, and I believe with him as the first Chinese bishop of the American Church Mission that the whole church in China will feel the good results of his inspiring leadership.
Another letter of Laura's, written on October 26, 1941, was published here in March of 1942. The news had not reached the States that less than 2 months after writing her letter, she would be imprisoned by the Japanese. It is poignant to read of her last vacation in Maolin.
The trip was almost as unexpected as it was pleasant, as the idea of visiting Maolin seemed a dream to be realized only in happier days. I actually started out early one morning to walk the first part of the journey, about 25 miles, as that is the most dangerous part of the trip, and it is wise to go on foot and to attract as little attention as possible. A Chinese friend and I, with my cook and 2 other men as escorts and baggage carriers, left Wahoo by side streets and byways, walked on dikes through the fields, crossed a river that might have proven a barrier to further travel, hurried through bandit country of no man's land, and during the afternoon arrived at last in free China. Many mornings were spent in conferences and discussion about the diocesan work. But each day I had either a long walk into the country or else a shorter walk, investigating some of the nearby interesting places. And every day had some distinctive joy of its own, making the strain and hazards of the trip out and back shrink far into the background. One lives close to nature in Maolin. During 1 week while I was there, a snake tried to join our party via a hole in the ceiling. A large centipede was found, a bat flew in, and a pig wandered into the back courtyard. As I returned, it was refreshing to think back over the experiences of the time spent in Maolin.
She was taken prisoner on December 8 and spent the terrible years in various Japanese concentration camps until the summer of 1945. She returned to Scotland Neck with her health broken, but insisted on returning to China in early 1946. She died on Thanksgiving Day, 1948, in St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Shanghai, and at her request, was buried in China. Very truly I tell you, the one who believes in me will also do the works that I do, and in fact will do greater works than these, because I am going to the Father. I will do whatever you ask in my name, so that the Father may be glorified in the Son. If in my name you ask for anything, I will do it. Jesus speaking in St. John's Gospel. Archbishop William Temple, in his profound interpretation of St. John's Gospel, titled Readings in St. John's Gospel, says this about us and the Church's mission. He's writing in 1938. In scale, if not quality, the works of Christ wrought through his disciples are greater than those wrought by him in his earthly ministry. It is a greater thing to have founded hospitals all over Europe and many parts of Africa and Asia than to have healed some scores or hundreds of folk in Palestine. And it is to the Spirit of Christ at work in our hearts, in the hearts of men, we owe the establishment of hospitals. Because of Christ's ascension, his works are no longer limited to Palestine, but are diffused over the world. This is an important point for us, because the Episcopal Church women who dedicated themselves to the service of others would not have done so were it not for their steadfast faith in and obedience to the loving Christ. Robina Tillinghast was born in Fayetteville in 1842. Her father lost his hearing in childhood as a result of whooping cough. And that sad loss, in the miracle of God's power to transform evil into good, caused his daughter to devote her life to serving deaf people in this diocese. Remembering the words of Archbishop Temple quoted earlier, we can declare with gratitude that the deaf people of North Carolina, especially in this city of Durham, were raised into their full humanity because of the work of faithful Episcopalians like Robina Tillinghast and the much more famous, the Reverend Thomas Gallaudet, whose ministry resulted in the supremely effective University for the Deaf, the first in the world that carries his name. In this diocese, ministry to the deaf community started in 1906 at St. Philip's Church in Durham, with the Reverend Sidney Bost assisted by Robina Tillinghast, because she was supported by both the parish and the Women's Auxiliary. She gave annual reports to the women concerning her work. And here she is now, in her own words, Miss Robina.
My love for and care for the well-being of deaf people started in our own home with our dear parents who could not hear. It was my father and mother who proved to me that the deaf have an equal ability with hearing folk to learn, to read, to write, to work, and to be useful citizens. The Christian education of deaf people became my primary focus, not only for the white members of the church, but also for our colored brothers and sisters. I concentrated my work at St. Philip's in Durham, since they not only were the most forward-thinking congregation in terms of holding worship services entirely in sign language, but they were also my employers, together with the Women's Auxiliary. I also organized Sunday school classes in Charlotte, Winston-Salem, Greensboro, High Point, and Raleigh. And because the Lord put it in my heart, I found it proper and good to organize classes for the colored deaf in their own Episcopal churches, namely St. Titus's in Durham and St. Michael's and All Angels in Charlotte. I have not confined myself to education and to Christian teaching alone. The deaf, like the rest of us, have a life outside the church, what I call the social aspect. In their social life, the deaf are greatly handicapped, and the problems which confront them in trying to earn a livelihood, to care for their sick, to properly rear and educate their children, to take their rightful place in the community, are almost endless. They must, of necessity, have some interpreter between them and the outside world whom they can love and trust to help in the solution of their problems. This is a role I am able to fulfill. I recall an interesting and amusing incident in a town near Salisbury. The bride's father greeted me with these words, "I'm so glad you could come, because our preacher told me today he didn't know how to get them married without you." There are also stories of changed lives and healing. In December 1911, a young widow who was broken in health and spirits and almost destitute was sent to us to see what we could do for her. The Watts Hospital took her in the charity ward, and she received every care and attention, the physician giving her his services freely. After an operation and 3 months treatment, she regained her health. She has lately obtained suitable work in the mill by which she earns her living. She was confirmed in St. Philip's Church in March of this year. Now she is one of the brightest and happiest members of our colony and is constantly calling down blessings on those who have made life over anew for her. There are so many touching individual stories, but I must save them for another time. In addition to worship services given to at least 150 deaf mutes in 6 towns where I have been present, I instruct my charges for confirmation. Let me finish with the answer of a very bright young girl to the question, how does the mission of the church help you? She said, it helps me to enjoy life to the fullest extent. It is the best thing in the whole city of Durham.
Thank you, Miss Rowena. On March 15, 1939, the Sentinel of Winston-Salem featured the photograph of an Episcopal church woman. The caption read as follows: "Here is Miss Lily Hill, well known throughout Rockingham and adjoining counties for her ceaseless fight for Christian forces." We don't know who the editor was, but apparently he had understood something of St. Paul's words. Miss Hill fought powers and principalities in the form of prejudice against prisoners within a church that had not yet started ministries with people in prison. She fought injustice and sin and all kinds of powers by being a force for good among people ignored, forgotten, or despised by the rest of society. At a time when ordination of women was something unheard of, she truly served as a minister, even starting a mission parish that had begun meetings in her own home. A woman of small stature who never married, she accomplished what we heard earlier from both the Gospel of St. John and Archbishop Temple. She fulfilled the promise of Jesus that his disciples would do greater works than he when he was on earth. Let's hear from Mrs. John Cunningham of St. Andrew's, Greensboro first, because Miss Hill does not like to talk about herself.
So impressed were we by her good works that we asked our rector, the Reverend Nash, to make it possible for us to secure for her a Ford to use in her work. The matter was brought to the Women's Auxiliary the next afternoon, and they started to raise the necessary funds. This happened in a congregation that, though small, had already raised a tremendous amount of money for various ministries here and abroad. Yet, on October 9th, a procession of us arrived at Miss Hill's mission house with a Ford car for her needs.
In addition to that, she adopted children and raised them. Her ministries were many and varied, but as she herself will tell you now, the mission closest to her heart was with prisoners. Miss Hill, better known as Mother Hill.
They call me Mother Hill, and I accept the name with pride and gratitude. The Lord put it in my heart to teach the Bible to prisoners here in Rockingham County. I have taught them in Sunday school for more years than I can remember, and tried every holiday season to show them that they are not forgotten. My favorite activity has been to decorate Christmas trees for them loaded with candy, and how much I appreciate the women of the churches who made this possible. Let me share with you a letter I received from one particular prisoner. Dear sister, I want to thank you for your remembrance on Thanksgiving. Had it not been for your service rendered, we wouldn't have had any notice that there was a Christian institution of any kind in Rockingham County. They all passed by on the other side, while your group picked us up, and it was effective and will be long remembered. And you shall be among those in Matthew 25:34. I bid you Godspeed in all your future efforts. I am giving voice to all the prisoners in Rockingham County Jail. I remain yours in Christ, Reverend S.D. Quarles, prisoner. I work in 5 missions and love everything the Lord has given me to do in His service. I wish all of you could know the satisfaction of writing 700 cards at Christmas time to prisoners, many of them forgotten men in Central Prison in Raleigh. I am so thankful that the gift of that Ford makes it possible for me to drive 1,000 miles a month to serve my parishioners and to follow up with prisoners who have been released. And I love visiting the families of those who are incarcerated and cannot visit themselves. I am now approaching the half-century mark of my work in God's vineyard. It's time for someone else to continue my labors of love. Thank you for the privilege.
We wonder sometimes what church women did and how they were viewed before their ordination became possible 35 years ago. Did they only raise money? Did they bake and feed the congregation and clean up afterwards in the kitchen? Did they stay within the confines of the Woman's Auxiliary? The name itself shows that they were helpers to the male organizations of the church. Remarkable women like Mrs. Wilkes used their high standing in the community to raise large funds for important institutions like hospitals. Missionaries like the modest Laura Clark and Lily Hill were called secretaries or teachers or simply volunteers. But it is obvious that they worked just as hard as ordained men. One of the fascinating missionaries who doesn't hesitate to express her irritation at being put upon is Bessie Blacknall of Holy Innocents Henderson. The crazy quilt given in her honor is displayed in the adjoining room, and you may already know something about her. She served as a missionary in Alaska for 27 years. Alaska at that time was a hardship mission. She was called to become a missionary after attending a Woman's Auxiliary Missionary Institute. Her letters from the mission field in the early years of World War II give us a very strong impression of both her stamina and the attitude and finances of the church at the time. Keep in mind that the normal and necessary staff for Nenana, where she served, was 4 women and 1 man who looked after the upkeep of the mission. Let's hear from her. Bessie?
March 31st, 1941 is the date to determine the financial cuts of our appropriation. We are wondering, hoping, and praying but most fearful that amount cannot be raised in this short time at least. Just what all this is going to mean to us here, we do not know yet. But we do know that we will have to reduce the size of the school. Even if we had sufficient funds to carry on at the same rate, we certainly cannot do so with only 2 women missionaries to do everything. And now I find that Deaconess Thompson must go out in May for a 4-month furlough, and that means I will be left alone. I do not see how one human being can do what there is here to be done. Bishop Bentley will be away nearly all the summer, which means that I will have to conduct all the services, bury all the dead, and try to settle all the drunken fights in the village. I will do the very best I can, but I think it is cruel to put such responsibility and so much work on one person. What do you think?
That's right. The following year, after 25 years of hard work in the field, Bessie is resting in Henderson when Bishop Bentley again asks her to return to Alaska to fill in for a missionary couple who are due a furlough.
I felt I could not refuse, and of course I'm glad that I did not. The journey was long because of Army regulations and delays, but the trip up the mighty Yukon was rather tiresome, taking 8 hours to make the 40 miles. Fortunately, a young nurse, Miss Anderson, is also serving here. I am to take the church services, look after the mission accounts, do the housekeeping and general supervision. Miss Anderson does all the nursing, takes care of the arts and crafts for the women, and is acting postmistress. I am to be her clerk. She and I will teach the Sunday school, church school, and smaller day pupils. Last Tuesday night, Miss Anderson was out until 2 a.m. taking care of the arrival of a baby. The next night, she was up all night with it. She gave it 2 transfusions, taking the blood from her own veins. She realized during the night that the chances for recovery were slim, so she baptized the babe, and the next morning it passed away. Poor Miss Anderson was so distressed. That afternoon, I had the funeral from the church and climbed the hill behind the mission to the graveyard. There are also lighter moments. One evening, Miss Anderson and I went to visit some of the families. We had went into an igloo, or kind of an underground house, nearest to an igloo than anything I've ever seen. We fairly crawled in, and there, sitting on the floor, was an old man who could not read or speak English, looking at a copy of Life magazine.
Thank you, Ms. There is no one in the Episcopal Church in North Carolina who has not heard of the Thompson Children's Home, or there shouldn't be. It is mentioned in every diocesan convention in each of the 3 dioceses. There are opportunities to contribute at certain times of the year through the parish. Women of the church make it a point to visit the site and to contribute. Almost all of us, mothers and grandmothers ourselves, loving children, wanting the best for children, and knowing that not all children are blessed with unconditional love and a home that nurtures them, all of us have felt compassion for the children at Thompson and have expressed it in one way or another. Thompson started out as an orphanage, but now it is called Thompson Child and Family Focus. The name denoting how the understanding of children's needs and methods of education and therapy has changed through the 125 years of its existence and service. This now progressive and effective institution would not have survived had it not been for thousands of North Carolina women who contributed to its ministry, starting with mere pennies in the late 1800s, when it was a much-needed orphanage. You see, if we subtract the century and a quarter of its existence from our current year, we are confronted with the years and aftermath of the Civil War and realize the terrible need for an orphanage at that time. How did they survive? Behind any successful fundraising is at least one woman who makes it her stubborn and persistent mission to find any means possible to keep the ministry alive. Such a woman was Becky Cameron, better known as Aunt Becky. She cajoled adults and children all over North Carolina not to forget those in the orphanage. Aunt Becky.
I wrote to a woman who had sent a memorial contribution. We learned the lesson God means to teach us, my dear madam, when we make our griefs and losses minister to the sorrows and sufferings of others. And what we do in loving memory of our own for others is by far the most beautiful memorial we can raise to them, and the only one, could they but speak to us now, that they would have. I wrote to remind people who had stopped giving. What has become of you all? There are just 4 teensy tiny little fellows out of a whole great big stateful. Shall I say, like the grandmothers of blessed memory, oh, fie, for shame! At the turn of the century, I came up with a giving plan. I wish we could make some plan by which each communicant in the 3 dioceses would contribute a fixed sum, say 1 cent a day, or 5 cents a week, or even 1 cent, and really pay it to a treasurer in each parish, so that it could go on the 1st of every month to Mr. Smith. Then he would have some sort of fixed income to count upon and be released from the present dreadful weight of uncertainty. The only hope of the Church's ever being lifted above her present condition of mendicancy, of begging for all she needs, lies in the teaching and training of children to give tithes of all they possess as a matter of distinct and inescapable obligation, as binding as the 10 Commandments or daily prayers. Even the Pharisee could say that he did that much, and surely Christians ought not to do less.
Merciful God, we offer our gratitude for the women who served in your name at home and overseas. Only you know the extent of their service, suffering, and sacrifice. And only you know the names of so many others who are unknown to us. May we find the strength and faith to rise to the high standards they set for us through the long decades of life in your church. Amen.